happy to be granted a phone interview with Alexander C. Juden, Alex to us, former Secretary and General Counsel for Schlumberger, now SLB, who has started a new career as an author. In the past, we've reported on several of our oilfield friends becoming authors. Alex, how did you get started in writing?
I was writing when I was in the Navy. I started a whole bunch of books that I started writing when I was still in flight school. But I'm not sure those will ever see the light of day, just because I've gotten more interested in, between the wars, right after World War I just find that time to be fascinating because there was, so much potential and, so much was up in the air, and it just happened to spin a certain way. And so I find that to be really interesting.
Let's rewind just a bit. You've really had an amazing career, including working in the oil and gas industry. Step us through the highlights of that.
I'm one of those people, Phil, I went to Rice, but I wasn't in the ROTC. And I went to Rice, and I wasn't really sure what I wanted to be when I grew up. And so I got out, and I worked at Harris County pretrial, so I interviewed people who had been arrested for personal recognizance bonds. And the only, that was sort of the path to one of two things, law school or being a probation officer. And I didn't want to do either one. My mother sure wanted me to be a lawyer, but I'm like, to hell with that. I'll never be a lawyer. I didn't like those paths. Then I ultimately just joined the Navy. Went through aviation officer candidate school. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie An Officer and a Gentleman, but I went through the one in Pensacola. And Deborah Winger was not my girlfriend. And I was the first class to graduate in 1985. So 0185 was my class number. I flew helicopters. So I went through fixed wing, and the Navy teaches you fixed wing and then rotary wing. I went through fixed wing in Pensacola. My mission when I was in was to fly troops and cargo out to the fleet, wherever it happened to be. And I was based out of Sigonella, Sicily. And so I was in SIG for almost 3 years. And we detached all through the Mediterranean. And I've always loved Europe. My dad was in the Army, and so I spent a lot of time there. But yeah, I flew helicopters in the fleet for through August of '89, then came back and went. I was a recruiter in Houston because I knew I was going to get out. And by that time, I'm like, hell yes, I'll be a lawyer. So I took orders to be a naval recruiter in Houston. Ended up running the officer programs and did that for about 2 years, just under 2 years, I think, and then got out in 91 and went to law school. And then I was a lawyer in Houston, private practice, for almost 7 years with various firms. Tried cases and really liked the litigation side of it, the going to trial, talking to juries. That's really fun. But it's also incredibly time-consuming, stressful, and difficult. And the last firm I was at came apart. The partners decided to go their separate ways, and that wound up the law firm. And so I and all the other people at the firm were laid off. And so I worked for myself for a little while, and that's when I really started the book we're talking about today. And as I said, I wrote about 10,000 words, and then I had two opportunities. I could have gone back to one of the firms I'd already worked with, or I got an offer from Schlumberger. And so I wasn't really that enamored with what the job was going to be until I asked, what happened to the guy who is, I assume I'm replacing somebody. He's like, oh yeah, Max Boussiet. But Max was being transferred to Kuala Lumpur. And I said, why on earth is Max being transferred to Kuala Lumpur? What qualifies him to do that? And Mike was like, well, in Schlumberger, you move every 2.5, 3 years. And if you're good, you get a different job. And I said, so you mean I could be transferred to Kuala Lumpur? And he's like, well, of course. I went and I said, can I go home and put a suit on? And so I did. I went home and put on my suit and then interviewed, got the job. And sure enough, I was in litigation for a little less than 2.5 years, 2 years and about 2 months, and I got transferred to England. And so it was exactly what I expected and wanted, because my dad was in the Army, and so I grew up moving around, and I wanted my kids to have that opportunity. I just think it makes you a broader person. Gives you an appreciation for other cultures and other ways of doing things and other ways of thinking. And I really liked that. And so I wanted my kids to have that. But we were only overseas for about 3 years when I got transferred back to compliance, which is where you and I worked a lot together. The path on the job. I didn't really write at all during that time.
So you went from the Navy to trial law to corporate law in the oil service industry. What got you back into writing?
The thing for me is I write because I love to write. It's really fun for me. I love the research. I mean, I was a history major in college, and, some people are stat geeks. I'm a history geek. And so you can drop me into, original source history documents, and I can fall into those rabbit holes, even that have nothing to do with the book, for hours and just get lost.
Alex, your book reminds me a lot of one of my favorite authors, James Michener, because there's a lot of real history tied into the fiction.
Yeah, and that's actually very nice of you to say, because that's what I wanted to do. My ulterior motive in writing these, one, I love to do it, as I said, is I'm trying to teach people some history at the same time. The thing about history, you have to be a little careful, because the history I teach is, it's my version of some of these events. Like, was Clemenceau really sort of the Machiavellian guy I paint him to be? Oh, I think he was. That's certainly my view of the history and what I've read. Was Wilson duped to some degree? I don't know that he was duped, but he wasn't nearly as clever as he thought he was. Again, that's my view.
Yeah.
Now, and there's probably others who would entirely disagree with me, and that's fine. That's why it's interesting to me. So for me, the process, one, I took a bunch of classes when I was at Rice, both as an undergrad and then after I graduated, when I was recruiting, I took a 400 level course in German history from a professor who I thought was great, a guy named Francis Lowenheim, who was really excellent. And so I really fell in love with the period. And for me, the process, I'm not a big outliner. If I'm going to write a motion for summary judgment as a lawyer, absolutely I'll outline. But I'm writing a work of fiction, and I actually don't know what's going to happen. I have a general sense of where the characters will end up, kind of, but I don't know how they get there. I don't know. What happens is, as I do research, I run into other stuff that I had never expected. And like in this book, I'd never heard of Eugene Bullard before I started this. And as I say, I think in the acknowledgments, I heard an Engines of Our Ingenuity on NPM, National Public Media from U of H, and they did an episode on Eugene Bullard. I'm like, that guy sounds very interesting. And so I read a little more about him, and he just found his way into the book because I found him to be so interesting. And I find, I think the racial issues at that time are so important and important now. And so I found him to continue to be relevant, and I wanted him to be in the book. But he was not somebody I even thought about at the time I started the book. So in the process, the other thing to keep in mind is, I'm new at this, so you get better the longer you do it. I don't know that that's necessarily true. One thing I did require of myself is I write 500 words a day. I treat it like a job. I have a routine. I get up in the morning, I go to the gym, I come back from the gym, and I start to work. And that is research and writing. But at the end of it, I want to have 500 words. And they may be crap, Phil. I mean, they may not find their way into the book, but they by doing that, it forces me to move forward. So I don't get stuck. I'm not allowed to get stuck. Because when I'm stuck, and it happens a lot, where I'm like, hell, I don't know what happens now. Who knows what happens now? I'll say to my wife, I feel bad for her. I'm like, can you just write this part for me and tell me what happens? And she's like, yeah, I don't do that. You do that. And then I have to sort of write my way out of whatever wall I've run into. So 500 words a day. So, there's days when I don't get all 500. It'll be 250 because I spent so much time researching. Or it'll be, 1,500, 2,000. If I know what's happening, if I figured it out, and now it's just delivering the scenes in the book, then it goes really. That's when it goes easy. And one thing that I've found in the writing is because I don't outline, the timelines screw me up. And the biggest changes I made in the first one were really to sort of get the timing to work. You know, if the baseball game is April 23rd, and that game occurred, and the score was the score, and Babe Ruth, you know, it was, and, you know, all that stuff's true. But that sort of limits me on, well, when can you take a boat to, you know, to London, and how does all that timing work?
Yeah,
and that was more challenging in the first one. For the second one, I was just about done, and I'm like, okay, you got to write all the dates down. And so I wrote all the dates down. And for the third one, I have sort of a running tally of all the dates when stuff happens, so that I don't stumble into errors in chronology that I've made myself.
Right. Tell us about your decisions in publishing Red Tiger Hunting.
I'm lucky in that I don't need to publish the book to eat. I mean, I'm just not, you know, I've retired from Schlumberger.
Yeah,
so you know, that's good.
Yeah.
Which means if I don't have the appetite or the energy or the patience for getting an agent or getting a publisher, I don't have to do it. And I have not done it. So what I did is I've self-published. We have a little publishing company, 5 Points Press, that, you know, the book is published under, you know, that name. And I don't have an agent. I don't have a publisher. But the impact then is you have less sales. And so it's not, you know, are you going to see it on the bestseller list in the near future? Well, two reasons. You probably won't see that. One, I don't have an agent or publisher. And two, I'm not sure it should be on the bestseller list. But you never know. So by self-publishing, I have sort of self-limited the publicity. But I just don't, I'm not doing this. I do this because I like to write. I don't do this because I need to sell a bunch of books.
Yeah,
and I don't want to take the time to do a lot of marketing. And so I've taken it by Murder by the Book here in town and Blue Willow Bookstore out in Memorial, and they have it. They carry it. They read it. Their book buyer thought, okay, yeah, this is pretty good. We'll carry this book, and so they carry it. And I've gotten some book reviews that are pretty solid. And so, you know, over time, you know, will it get picked up a little more? Maybe. But I've had some great advice from a lady named Deborah Garner, who's written a bunch of books, and she's a good friend of my sister. And she said the best advertising for your first book is your second book. And so, if and when I can get the second one out, what I hope to see is that the sales of the first one pick up a little bit. And that would make sense, because the truth is, I want people to know this history. I think it's important, but I'm just unwilling to put the time in because to get an agent, you have to write the agent, and to get a publisher, you have to do the same thing. And, you know, in some instances, you have to do a summary of each chapter, and it's a real sales effort. And I'm just not going to do it. It's not going to happen.
One last question. When will the new edition, Part 2, be published?
So, great question. So my primary editor is my wife. So she's got it right now. And by editors, I don't need her to, you know, dot the T's, cross the I's, put the commas in. She's a big picture story person, so she reads it. She has a book review called 832 Book Review. And so she reads a ton, and so she has a general sense of what works, what doesn't work. And so she's reading it now. And then I'll send it to my sister, who's an editor, and she'll edit it. And she's very good at inconsistencies within chronologies and story inconsistencies. And she's really good at that. And then I'll do a third editor, sort of copy editor, line editor, Annie, who is very good, and she'll do the final edit. I've got the cover in work now, but it's going to be, the cover can't really get done until I finish the book and I know what the blurb is that goes on the back, and so that's going to be delayed. But so to answer the question, that's a long way of saying 3 to 4 months out, and that might be optimistic. So if I get it out by the end of the year, I'd be okay with that. I wouldn't be happy, but I'd be okay with that. but it could be the following year. It could be next year.
Right.
I don't think that's the case. I mean, it's written, but my wife may say, this doesn't work. You got to change whole sections.
Well, I've got to say, Alex, it sounds like you did much better than Deborah Winger. Congratulations on your book, and thank you very much for taking the time to tell us about your career transition to author. For the record, this production was edited. As anyone who worked in the oil field knows, no conversation is complete without telling stories and comparing notes on mutual friends. Red Tiger Hunting is now available on Amazon. We look forward to the release of the next book in the series.